Cowboy saved a young native girl from whipping. Next day, she came to his cabin for pay him back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind pushed dust down the main street of Twin Creek and rattled a loose sign over the Mercantile. It was late afternoon, late autumn 1882, the sun already slipping behind the ridge and throwing long shadows over the town. Most of the street was quiet, a dog sleeping by the smithy, a wagon creaking as it settled near the hitch rail. But near the sheriff's post a crowd had gathered, their faces red with anger or red with excitement. Taya stood with her wrists tied above her head to the crossbar, her cheeks scraped raw from when they dragged her across the dirt. Her deerskin dress hung torn, one shoulder bare, the collar ripped down far enough that she clutched at it with her bound hands to hold it together. She felt the cold air sting against her skin, and it wasn't the chill that made her stomach twist, but the stares. She'd been caught stealing bread from the Mercantile that morning. It wasn't much, one small loaf, but the storekeeper had shouted loud enough to bring half the town running. She had tried to explain, but no one cared to hear her words. They tied her to the post before she could run and told her she would wait there until the sheriff came back from riding out. They said she'd be whipped as example. She had stood there for hours, her back aching, her legs shaking, until the afternoon brought more people out to see. She didn't cry, not where they could see. She kept her eyes down and count her breaths. The whip cracked once on the dirt just to scare her, and she flinched, her heart banging against her ribs. The man holding it smirked and rolled his shoulders like he was warming up. That was when Colt Maddox stepped out of the shadow between the livery and the saloon. He was tall, coat dusted from the trail, hat brim low, Henry rifle hanging from his shoulder. Colt wasn't from this town. He had been riding for weeks, taking jobs where he could, staying nowhere longer than needed. He'd lost men once, years back, when a posse he led chased the wrong trail and walked into an ambush. The memory stayed with him like a stone in his gut. Since then, he kept his distance from people, but something still made his blood go cold. The sight of a crowd ready to whip a half-starved girl was one of those things. He crossed the street slow, boots crunching in the dirt, and stopped a few feet from the post. He didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke it carried. "Untie her." The man with the whip spat in the dirt. "Sheriff said she stays till he gets back." Colt's hand dropped the rifle from his shoulder, and he held it easy in front of him, barrel toward the ground, but ready to swing up. He looked at the man, then at the rest of the crowd, and his face didn't change. "I said untie her." A long silence followed. Someone coughed. A woman tugged her boy back from the edge of the crowd. The man with the whip hesitated, then stepped back, muttering under his breath. Colt moved forward, his movement steady, untied the rope from the post, and eased Taya's hands down. Her arms shook from holding them up so long, and her knees almost buckled when she tried to stand. Colt caught her by the elbow, steadying her with one big hand until she found her balance. She looked up at him once, just long enough to see that his eyes were calm but hard. He shrugged out his trail coat and swung it over her shoulders, tying it once at the waist so it wouldn't slip. The coat swallowed her frame, but she pulled it closed with both hands, breathing hard. Colt didn't look back at the crowd. He just guided her forward with a hand at her back and walked her out of town. No one followed. They passed the last building and reached the cottonwood grove where Colt had left his horse. He helped her mount, swung up behind her, and started the ride toward his cabin. He didn't speak the whole way, just kept the horse at a slow trot so she wouldn't fall. Taya's thoughts churned like a storm as they rode. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he'd stopped them, but every step away from that post loosened something tight in her chest. She kept the coat clutched around her, feeling the heavy warmth of it and the faint smell of smoke and leather. By the time they reached Colt's place, dusk had settled over the valley. The cabin sat low against the trees, smoke just starting from the chimney. Colt dismounted first, then turned and lifted her down carefully, his hands firm but not rough. Inside, he lit the lamp, stoked the fire higher, and set out a tin plate of beans and a cup of water. He slid them across the table toward her and stepped back. Taya sat on the bench, hands shaking as she ate. The first bite made her throat tighten, but she forced it down. She didn't look up at him except once quick to see if he was angry. He wasn't. He just stood there by the hearth, arms folded, watching the fire like it might tell him what to do next. When she finished eating, Colt pointed toward the bedroll laid near the hearth. "You can sleep there," he said. His voice was quiet but not unkind. Taya nodded once, clutching the coat tighter around herself. She wanted to speak, to say thank you, or to explain, but no words came. Colt hung his hat on the peg, sat on the edge of his bunk, and started cleaning his revolver slow and methodical. After a while, he lay back, turning toward the wall. The cabin was silent except for the soft hiss of the fire. Taya curled up on the bedroll, the coat still around her, and listened to the steady sound of Colt's breathing until sleep finally dragged her under. Morning broke pale and thin through the cabin window. Colt woke to the smell of cold ash and the faint sound of boots outside. He sat up, hand instinctively finding the revolver near his bunk, but there was no danger, just silence. The bedroll near the hearth was empty. He stood and looked toward the door. His coat was gone. For a long minute, he stayed still, listening. The valley outside was quiet except for the creak of pines in the wind. She was gone. Colt breathed out once and set about his morning. He wasn't surprised. Most people who found his place left by first light. That was how he had built his life. Let no one stay long enough to tangle with his past. He ate cold beans from the night before, saddled the horse, and was just about to ride into town for supplies when movement by the fence line caught his eye. She was standing there, hair loose around her face, the coat still over her shoulders. Her dress was torn the same as yesterday, but she had washed the dirt from her skin somewhere. Her face was clean though wind-chapped, and she held herself straighter than last night. "I came back," she said, voice low, as if half expecting him to send her away. Colt watched her for a long moment, jaw tight. Part of him wanted to tell her to keep walking, that it was better for both of them if she didn't stay. But she looked cold and tired, and there was no fight left in her shoulders. He nodded toward the woodpile stacked near the cabin. "If you're staying, we need wood for the fire." Her dark eyes met his, searching his face for any hint of cruelty. When she saw none, she moved to the pile and began carrying logs, one at a time, stacking them by the door. Her movements were slow but careful, like she needed to prove she was worth the space she'd taken last night. Colt unsaddled the horse and went inside. When she finished, she followed him in, hovering near the doorway until he gestured toward the bench. He set a pot on the stove and warmed beans, adding a bit of jerky for her. She ate slowly, glancing up once or twice, like she was waiting for him to ask questions about why she'd stolen from the mercantile. Colt didn't. He wasn't the kind of man who pried words out of anyone. When she finished, she said quietly, "I'll go if you want me to." Colt shook his head. "You're fine here." He said it simply, but something in his voice made her shoulders lower, just slightly, as if she'd been bracing for him to push her out. She helped sweep the floor and bring water from the creek without being told. She winced each time she stepped on her left foot. The rope had rubbed her ankle raw, but she didn't complain. Colt noticed and found a scrap of clean cloth, poured whiskey on it, and handed it to her. She flinched at the sting but tied it around the ankle tight. By late afternoon, the cabin felt less hollow. Colt sat by the hearth, oiling the rifle, while she sat on the bench mending one of his shirts. Her hands were skilled, small, sure stitches that spoke of someone who'd done this work all her life. When the collar of her own dress gaped open too far as she bent to thread the needle, Colt looked away, jaw tightening. He stood and fetched a needle and thread from the shelf. "Give me the dress," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. She froze, clutching the fabric at her chest. For a moment she thought he meant to take it from her entirely, and fear sparked in her stomach, but then she saw the spool of thread in his hand and understood. She handed him the dress carefully, holding the torn edge closed with one hand. Colt set down the rifle and crouched near the fire where the light was best, stitching the collar back together with steady, rough hands. When he was done, he handed it back. Their fingers touched, a small, quick brush, but it made her pulse jump. Colt straightened and stepped outside to split wood until the sun dipped low. That evening, as darkness closed around the valley, she finally spoke more than a few words. "They said I stole," she said, voice low but steady. Colt looked at her across the fire. "Did you?" "Yes. I hadn't eaten in 3 days." She gripped the coat tighter around her. "I tried to work. They laughed at me. Colt nodded once, slow. He didn't offer pity, just let the silence settle. You're safe here, he said finally, and those 3 words made her throat tighten more than any kindness she'd been shown in months. She curled up on the bedroll again, this time without as much hesitation, and watched Colt from the corner of her eye as he cleaned his revolver by the fire. His face gave away nothing, but there was no anger in it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the door, but for the first time since yesterday morning, she felt warm. When she closed her eyes, the image of the post and the whip no longer came first. She saw the way he had stood in the street instead, coat still on his shoulders, voice low but final when he said, "Untie her." And that was enough to let her sleep. The third morning dawned with a sky the color of cold iron and frost still clinging to the grass. Colt woke to the sound of someone moving softly in the cabin. Not a stranger, but her. Taya was already up, feeding the fire and setting the tin plates on the table. She glanced over her shoulder once when she heard him sit up, but didn't speak, just went on quietly with what she was doing. Colt sat on the edge of the bunk for a long moment, watching her work. She had braided her hair back tight, tied with a strip of leather. It made her look sharper, stronger, less like the girl who had nearly fallen in the street 2 days ago. She set food in front of him, beans warmed in the pan, a heel of bread from yesterday, then sat at the far end of the table with her own plate. They ate in silence, but it wasn't heavy this time. Colt noticed she didn't hide her face the way she had the night before. When they finished, he stood and pulled his hat from the peg. "I'm going to town for supplies," he said. She stiffened slightly, fingers curling on the edge of the table. Colt saw it and hesitated. "You can stay here," he said after a pause. Taya shook her head. "If I stay, they'll come looking." Colt's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. The man with the whip hadn't liked being made to back down, and news traveled fast in towns this small. If she stayed here, they'd guess where she was. "All right," Colt said finally. "You ride with me. Keep the coat on." She obeyed without question, pulling the coat close around her as they saddled the horse. Colt helped her mount and swung up behind her. They rode into town just after midday, the street busier now than it had been the day he cut her loose. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. Colt kept his face blank, his hand resting loose on the reins. He dismounted in front of the mercantile, tied the horse, and helped her down. Inside, the storekeeper's eyes went wide when he saw her. "You got nerve bringing her back in here," he said, voice sharp. "She's with me," Colt said evenly. The storekeeper opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then shut it again when he saw Colt's expression. Colt didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, but the weight in his tone made the air go still. He bought what he came for: flour, coffee, jerky, a bar of soap, and a length of sturdy cloth, then paid in full and turned to leave. Taya kept close behind him, chin down, but she saw the looks from the women near the door, the whispers that followed them out. When they were back on the horse, she let out a slow breath. "They hate me," she said quietly. Colt adjusted his hat against the sun. "Let him." She glanced back at him, searching his face. "Why do you help me?" He didn't answer right away. The question sat heavy between them until he said, "Because I've seen what happens when no one steps in." That was all he gave her, and she didn't push for more. Back at the cabin, she bathed by the creek with the soap he'd bought. Colt stayed near enough to keep watch, but far enough not to stare, busying himself with checking the horse's hooves. When she came back, her skin was red from the cold but clean, and she looked more herself than she had since he'd found her. That night, she worked by lamplight cutting the cloth into strips to mend her dress completely. Colt sat across from her, sharpening his knife and watching the firelight catch on the neat stitches she made. It was the first time he noticed her hum softly under her breath while she worked. Not a song, just a low sound to keep her hand steady. When she pricked her finger and hissed, Colt set his knife down and stood. "Let me see." She held out her hand reluctantly. He took it, rough thumb brushing over the tiny bead of blood, then tore a strip from a rag and tied it around her finger. His touch was careful, almost too careful, like he was reminding himself not to cross some line. "Thank you," she said, and the way she looked at him made something shift in his chest. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "Get some sleep," he said, voice lower than usual. She obeyed, curling up on the bedroll again, but this time her breathing stayed slow and steady. She didn't keep her face turned to the wall. Colt sat by the fire a long time, staring into the flames, turning over the question she had asked on the ride back: why he helped her. The truth was, he hadn't planned on it. When he saw her tied to that post, something in him just wouldn't let it happen. He'd ridden away from trouble most of his life since that ambush years ago, but this time he'd stepped forward. He didn't know yet what that meant, or why he hadn't told her to leave. But as the fire burned low and the cabin went quiet, Colt realized he didn't mind that she was still there. The next morning the sky was heavy with low clouds, and the air smelled of coming snow. Colt rose early, the habit of a man who had never quite learned to sleep easy. He found Taya sitting by the fire, already awake, sewing the last strip of cloth into her dress collar. When she finished, she smoothed it over her chest and looked at him, waiting. "Fits," he said simply, and that small word brought a faint, cautious smile to her face. After breakfast, Colt saddled the horse for a trip to the lower pasture to check the fence line. He hesitated before leaving, looking at her as she stood near the doorway. "You'll be all right here alone?" he asked. She nodded. "I will keep the fire," she said quietly, as if promising more than just warmth. Colt gave a single nod, then rode out. The cabin was quiet in his absence, but for Taya, it was the first time she had been left with a roof over her head and no rope on her wrists. She swept the floor, fed the fire, and went outside to bring in water from the creek. Each task steadied her, made her feel less like the girl who had been tied to a post, and more like someone who belonged somewhere. By the time Colt returned, snow had started to fall in thin flurries. He dismounted, brushing the cold from his coat, but his eyes were sharp. "There were tracks by the creek," he said as he came in. "Two riders." Taya's hands stilled where she was folding the blanket. "They came close?" she asked. "Close enough," Colt said, setting his rifle by the door. "Likely looking to see if you're here." Fear flickered across her face. "They'll bring me back." Colt's jaw tightened. "Not while you're under my roof." He said it with a calm finality that made her heart thump. They stayed inside the rest of the day, keeping the lamps low. Colt worked on mending a broken hinge on the door, while Taya cooked what little meat they had left into a stew. The quiet between them was heavier than before, but it was not cold. More like both of them were listening for anything that might come from the dark. Just after nightfall, the sound of hoofbeats carried up the valley. Colt stood from the table and took his rifle from the peg, checking the chamber with a click that seemed too loud in the small cabin. "Stay behind the door," he said. Taya obeyed without question, crouching near the hearth. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Then came a voice, rough and familiar, the same man who had held the whip. "Maddox, you've got something that belongs to the town." Colt stepped onto the porch, rifle loose in his hands but ready. "She doesn't belong to you," Colt said evenly. "She's a thief," the man called back. "Sheriff says she faces judgment." Colt took one slow step forward until he was clear in the lantern light. "Then tell your sheriff to come himself." There was a pause, the sound of a horse shifting nervously. Then the man spat in the dirt. "This ain't finished," he said, and turned his horse back toward town. Colt stayed outside until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then came back in. Taya was still crouched near the fire, eyes wide, breathing fast. Colt set the rifle back on the peg and crouched so he was level with her. "No one's taking you," he said quietly, almost like an oath. Her shoulders shook once as she let out the breath she'd been holding. She nodded, clutching the edge of the coat he had given her, and for the first time she reached out and touched his sleeve. "Why do you do this?" she asked. Colt met her eyes for a long moment before answering. "Because I know what it's like to watch someone die when you could have stopped it," he said. His voice was low, rough. "I'm not letting that happen again." Something in her expression softened. She didn't speak, just nodded once, and went back to stirring the stew as if nothing had happened. But when Colt sat down again, she placed a bowl in front of him first before serving herself. They ate quietly, the fire crackling in the hearth. When the bowls were empty, Taya gathered them and washed them in silence. Colt watched her for a moment, then stood and helped dry them with a rag. The storm outside thickened, wind howling against the shutters. Colt made sure the door was barred, then sat by the fire, his boots crossed at the ankle. Taya stayed on the other side of the hearth, sewing a tear in one of his shirts. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed again, and this time Colt didn't pull away as quickly. "Get some rest," he said finally. She hesitated before lying down on the bedroll. For a long time, she watched him from across the fire, saw the hard line of his jaw slowly ease as the night went on. Outside, the wind kept up, but inside the cabin the fire burned steady, and for the first time since she had come back, Taya slept without fear waking her. Colt stayed awake longer, listening for hoofbeats that never came. When he finally lay down, it was with the thought that if they did come back, they'd find him ready. The storm rolled in before dawn, carrying fine snow that whirled against the cabin windows and hissed through the gaps in the shutters. Colt had been awake since the first groan of the wind. He put more wood on the fire, listening to the storm's weight settle over the valley. By the time Taya woke, the ground outside was white, and the fence posts were half buried. She sat up slowly, hair loose around her shoulders, and pulled the coat closer. "No one will come today," she said, half to herself. "Not in this weather," Colt agreed, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. She accepted hers carefully, warming her hands against the metal. The firelight threw shadows across her face, making her look younger, but stronger somehow. The cabin felt smaller with the storm pressing against it. They passed the hours quietly, each working on what could be done indoors. Colt sharpened tools and checked the rifle again, while Taya finished sewing the last patches on her dress. Around midday, the wind howled so hard the door rattled in its frame. Taya startled, looking toward it. Colt noticed and said, "Door's barred. Nothing's coming through." She nodded but moved closer to the fire, sitting on the floor rather than the bench. Colt watched her for a long moment before setting aside the whetstone and sitting opposite her, the fire between them. "You could leave when the snow clears," he said finally, voice even. Her head snapped up. "You want me to go?" "No." He hesitated, thumb running over the edge of his coffee cup. "But you could, if you wanted to." Taya shook her head slowly. "There's nowhere else," she said. "If I go back to town, they will tie me up again. If I go farther, I will starve." Colt nodded once, accepting the answer. He didn't press her further. By late afternoon, the storm showed no sign of breaking. Colt took a lantern and checked the roof for leaks, then stacked more wood by the hearth. When he came back inside, Taya was crouched near the fire, mending one of his socks. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I want to," she answered simply, and kept sewing. The small domestic sounds, the hiss of the fire, the soft pull of thread, the occasional crack of wind outside, made the cabin feel almost settled. Colt sat at the table, cleaning his revolver, but his eyes kept straying to her hands as they worked. As night fell, the wind rose to a steady roar. Colt moved his bedroll closer to the fire so he could keep watch on the door. Taya hesitated a moment, then laid hers close enough that the edge of the coat brushed his sleeve. When the storm struck hard enough to shake snow from the roof, she startled again and grabbed the edge of his coat before she realized what she was doing. Colt looked at her hand, then at her face. "You're safe," he said quietly. Her hand stayed there a moment longer before she let go, embarrassed. Later, when the fire had burned low, Colt saw her shivering under the blanket. He stood, took another from the shelf, and draped it over her shoulders without a word. She looked up at him, startled, then nodded once in thanks. Colt settled back down on his bedroll, stretching out his long legs. He felt her shift closer to the fire, and soon the sound of her breathing evened out. He stayed awake for a long time, staring at the flames, thinking about how quickly things had changed. 3 days ago, he had been alone, planning to leave this valley before winter set in. Now, there was someone on the other side of the fire, depending on him, someone who had nowhere else to go. Part of him wondered if he was making a mistake keeping her here, if the town would come back in force. But when he glanced at her, curled under the coat with the blanket around her shoulders, the thought of putting her back on the street made his chest tighten in a way he didn't like to examine. Outside, the storm finally began to quiet near dawn, the wind dropping to a low moan through the trees. Colt let himself doze at last, his hand resting near the rifle, the fire still throwing a faint glow across the cabin walls. When Taya awoke later, she found him asleep for the first time since she had come, his face slack and peaceful in the dim light. She watched him for a long moment, then quietly fed the fire so he wouldn't wake cold. The storm left the valley hushed the next morning, the ground covered in white. Colt rose before dawn, brushed snow from the doorway, and set to chopping wood in the brittle air. His breath came out in hard clouds, the axe cracking through the silence with each swing. Inside, Taya tended the fire and boiled water. She was beginning to move through the cabin like she belonged there, placing Colt's cup by his chair without asking, keeping his tools where he liked them, straightening the blankets. When Colt came back in, his cheeks raw from the cold, she handed him the steaming cup. "You didn't sleep much," she said softly. "Never do when there's trouble coming," Colt replied, sitting at the table. She hesitated, then asked the question she had held back for 2 days. "If they come back with more men, will you fight them?" Colt looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment. "If I have to," he said finally, "I won't let them take you." She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening on the edge of her dress. No one had ever said that to her. Not her father, not anyone. The words settled over her like the extra blanket he'd given her the night before, heavy but warm. By midday, Colt saddled the horse to check the lower trail for new tracks. Taya went with him this time, bundled in his coat. The world was quiet under the snow, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the horse's breathing. At the edge of the pasture, Colt dismounted and crouched near the ground. "Tracks," he said, pointing. 2. Maybe 3 riders came through here at dawn, headed toward the cabin, then turned back. Taya felt her stomach tighten. "They're watching us." "Likely." Colt stood, scanning the ridges. "They're waiting to see if I'll hand you over easy." He mounted again, voice firm. "They're wasting their time." Back at the cabin, Colt set about cleaning his rifle and checking the ammunition box. Taya watched him from across the room, sewing in silence until she finally asked, "Why do you care what happens to me? You don't even know me." Colt didn't look up from the rifle. "Don't need to know you to know what's right," he said. "They had no call to put a rope on you." She thought about that a long time, then said quietly, "When you cut me loose, I thought you were just another man who'd take what he wanted." Colt's hand stilled. He met her gaze across the room, his expression calm but serious. "I didn't bring you here for that." The words were plain, but they made something in her chest loosen. That night, Colt left the lantern burning low and sat by the door with a rifle across his lap. Taya lay on her bedroll, watching him in the half-light. After a long silence, she asked, "What happens if they bring the sheriff next time?" Colt's jaw flexed. "Then we see if the law is worth a damn in this town." The wind outside shifted, and somewhere far off a horse neighed. Colt stood and went to the window, watching the tree line. After a moment, he relaxed and came back to the fire. "Try to sleep," he said quietly. She nodded, though sleep didn't come easy. Sometime after midnight, she woke to find the fire low and Colt still awake, the rifle resting across his knees. "You don't trust them," she said softly from the shadows. "Not with you," he answered. Taya pulled the blanket tighter and lay back down, listening to the steady crackle of the fire. Knowing he was still sitting there kept her from drifting into the nightmares that had chased her every night since the post. At dawn, hoofbeats came again, slower this time, more deliberate. Colt stood, moved to the doorway, and waited. A rider appeared through the trees, a deputy this time, wearing the tin star crooked on his vest. He stopped short of the porch and tipped his hat. "Maddox," he said, voice cautious. "Sheriff says we can't have fugitives hiding out this close to town. He wants her brought in." "She's not going anywhere," Colt said. The deputy shifted in the saddle. "Sheriff won't like that answer." "Then tell him to come tell me himself," Colt replied, voice flat. The deputy nodded once, clearly uneasy, then turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. When Colt came back inside, Taya was standing near the hearth, her face pale. "You'll get yourself killed for me," she said. Colt set the rifle back on its peg. "I've been killed once already," he said, almost to himself. "This time I'm ready." Taya stepped closer, looking at him carefully. "Then I will stay ready too," she said. Colt met her eyes for a long moment. He saw no fear there now, only resolve. "Good," he said simply, and something between them settled into place. An understanding that they were no longer just sharing a cabin, but standing together against whatever came next. The day after the deputy's visit passed under a gray sky, the air sharp with the promise of more snow. Colt kept watch from the porch through most of the morning, scanning the ridge line for riders. Taya stayed close to the cabin, fetching water and sweeping the floor, as if keeping busy could quiet the tightness in her chest. By noon, no one had come. Colt came inside, stamping snow from his boots. "They're waiting," he said, setting his hat on the peg. "Trying to see if I'll give up first." "Will you?" she asked quietly. Colt's answer came without hesitation. "No." Her eyes held as a long moment, then she nodded once. The rest of the afternoon was spent in near silence, but it was not an uncomfortable one. Colt worked at the table, cleaning and reassembling the revolver piece by piece. Taya cooked stew from the last of the potatoes and salt pork, humming softly as she stirred. When the pot was ready, she set 2 bowls on the table. Colt sat opposite her. "You've made this place warmer," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. Taya blinked, then looked down at her bowl, hiding the quick smile that tried to form. "Only keep the fire going," she said. "That's more than most ever did." They ate slowly, and when the bowls were empty, Colt stayed seated, staring at the fire. After a long pause, he spoke again, voice low. "Before you came, I was planning to ride out before winter shut the trails." Taya's head came up, alarm flashing across her face. "You would leave this place?" "I had nothing holding me here," Colt said simply. "Now I do." The words landed like a weight between them, heavy but not unwelcome. Taya's chest rose and fell once, and she turned her face toward the fire so he wouldn't see how much those words mattered. By evening, the snow had begun again, soft and steady. Colt went outside to bring him more wood, and when he came back in, he found Taya brushing out her hair by the fire. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment neither spoke. "You should sit by the fire," he said, setting down the wood. She nodded and moved closer to the flames, the coat sliding from her shoulders as she worked the tangles from her hair. Colt caught himself looking too long, then turned away to hang his coat by the door. When he sat down across from her, the quiet between them was different, charged somehow. Taya set the brush aside and folded her hands in her lap. "You watch over me even when I sleep," she said softly. Colt met her gaze. "Because I know what's out there." "And what's in here?" she asked, tapping lightly at her chest. Colt hesitated, jaw tightening. "Something that's starting to feel alive again," he admitted. The air in the cabin felt warmer than the fire alone could make it. Taya shifted closer, her knees nearly touching his. For a long moment, neither moved, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the faint whistle of wind outside. When Taya reached out and placed her hand lightly on his arm, Colt didn't pull away. His hand turned, covering hers. "You're not afraid of me anymore," he said quietly. "I never was," she answered. "Only of what would happen when you sent me away." Colt shook his head slowly. "That's not happening." Her breath caught slightly, and before she could think too long about it, she leaned closer. Colt's eyes searched hers once, as if asking a question without speaking it. Then he closed the space between them. The kiss was slow, steady, without rush, the kind that carried every unspoken word they hadn't dared say since the day he untied her. When they finally drew back, Taya's hand was still on his arm, and Colt let out a slow breath, as if some weight had shifted off his shoulders. "You should get some rest," he said after a moment, voice softer than before. She nodded, but when she lay down on the bedroll, it was closer to the fire this time, close enough that the coat brushed the edge of Colt's boot. Colt stayed by the hearth until the fire burned low, rifle within reach, but no longer gripped as tightly. When he finally lay down, he didn't turn to face the wall this time. His eyes stayed on the fire, and now and then on the quiet shape curled up only a few feet away. Outside, the snow fell steady, muting the world beyond the cabin walls. Inside, for the first time since he had found her tied to that post, the silence between them no longer felt like a shield. It felt like the start of something neither of them wanted to lose. The snow finally stopped 2 days later, leaving the valley bright and quiet under a pale sun. Colt stood on the porch in the early morning, scanning the road that led to town. The cold bit through his coat, but he didn't move. He knew someone would come sooner or later. Men like the storekeeper didn't let go of a grudge. Taya came to stand just inside the doorway, arms folded across her chest, watching him. "You think they will ride up today?" she said. "They'll wait for clear ground to make a show of it," Colt said. "Snow gives them cover to say they were delayed. But yes, they'll come." Her fingers tightened on the edge of the coat she wore. "What will you do?" Colt turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "Same thing I did before. Stand between you and them." She nodded slowly, fear and something like pride warring on her face. The day passed slowly. Colt split wood and stacked it higher than usual near the cabin, both to stay busy and to fortify the place if he needed to hold it. Taya cooked stew again, her hands steadier than they'd been a week ago, moving with quiet confidence. She set a bowl in front of him before he could sit, and for a moment their eyes lingered. "You could still leave," Colt said after a while, voice quiet. "I told you, there is nowhere," she answered. Then she looked at him, straight-backed. "Even if there was, I wouldn't." Something in his chest eased at that. Near dusk, the sound of riders finally came. 3 this time, crunching through the snow in a slow, deliberate approach. Colt stood and took his rifle down from the peg. He checked the chamber, then nodded toward the corner. "Stay back," he told her. "No," she said firmly, stepping closer to the door. "I will not hide." Colt's brow furrowed. He started to argue, then saw the set of her jaw and nodded once. "Stay behind me, then." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting sharp. The 3 riders stopped several yards away. The man in the middle was the deputy, hat low against the light. "Maddox," the deputy called. "Sheriff says this is the last ask. Bring her in, and we'll call it square." Colt's voice was calm, even. "She stays here." The man on the left spat into the snow. "You planning to hole up and shoot your way out?" "If I have to," Colt said. The deputy shifted in his saddle, uneasy. "Sheriff doesn't want blood over this." "Then tell him to let it go," Colt said. "She paid enough just standing there in the cold while you all jeered at her." The man on the left swore and started to reach for the rifle at his saddle. Colt raised his Henry in one smooth motion, barrel leveled. "Don't," Colt said flatly. The man froze, hand still on the rifle strap. Taya stepped onto the porch then, standing just behind Colt's shoulder. The men's eyes went to her, and she lifted her chin though her hands were trembling at her sides. "I took bread," she said, voice steady, "because I was hungry. That is all." For a moment, there was only the sound of horses breathing in the cold air. The deputy looked from her to Colt, then sighed. "Sheriff will not ride out here again," he said finally. "He'll call it done if you stay clear of town." "She will," Colt said. The deputy nodded once, then turned his horse. The other men followed, muttering under their breath. Their hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving the valley quiet again. Colt let out a slow breath and lowered the rifle. "They'll leave us alone?" Taya asked, her voice quiet now that the tension had broken. "For now," Colt said. "That was their last try. They don't want to fight they can't win." Taya stepped closer to him on the porch, her hand brushing against his sleeve. "You stood for me again," she said softly. Colt looked down at her, his face still hard from the standoff, but his eyes softer. "I told you I would." They stayed there for a moment, watching the road until it was empty again. Then Colt turned and guided her back inside, shutting the door against the cold. The cabin felt warmer than it had all day. Colt set the rifle back on its peg and stoked the fire higher. Taya moved closer to the hearth, crouching near the flames. When she looked back at him, her face was no longer pale with fear, but lit with something else, gratitude, maybe, or relief. "You could have been shot," she said. "So could they," Colt replied. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Taya stood and crossed him. Her hand came up, resting against his chest. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said quietly. Colt's jaw worked, but he didn't speak. He just set his hand over hers, feeling the steady beat of his own heart under her palm. They stayed like that until the fire popped and sent sparks up the chimney. Then Colt said, almost gently, "Get some rest. Tomorrow we cut a new trail through the snow. You'll need boots that fit." "You will take me to town again?" she asked. Colt nodded. "To buy what you need, but not to beg forgiveness." Taya nodded once, a small smile touching her mouth. For the first time since she'd been dragged to the post, she felt like the ground under her feet might be steady again. That night, she laid her bedroll closer than ever before. Colt stayed by the fire until she fell asleep, then finally let himself sit back and close his eyes. The fight was not completely over. Men in towns like this didn't forget fast, but for tonight, the cabin was quiet, the fire steady, and the woman he had chosen to protect was still there. Morning came bright and cold, the snow glittering under a clear sky. Colt saddled the horse while Taya pulled on the coat, the mended dress visible underneath. For the first time since he'd known her, her hair was brushed smooth, falling down her back. She stood taller now, no longer shrinking as if waiting for someone to strike her. They rode to town together, the horses' hooves crunching over the frozen road. People stared when they came down a main street, but no one stepped forward this time. The whispers were there, but quieter, more watchful than hostile. Colt dismounted in front of the mercantile, tied the horse, and helped her down. He kept one hand on her back as they stepped inside. The storekeeper's face hardened when he saw them, but he said nothing, only stood behind the counter. Colt set coins on the wood, his voice steady. She needs boots, and a winter coat that fits. The storekeeper hesitated, then pulled what Colt asked for. Taya tried on the boots near the stove, stamping her feet to test them. They fit well enough, and when she looked up, Colt gave a single approving nod. When they left the store, Colt held the door for her and waited until she stepped outside first. It was a small thing, but it made Taya's chest warm. They rode home with a new bundle tied behind the saddle. When they reached the cabin, Taya carried the package inside and laid the coat out on the bench, running her hands over the heavy fabric. "I never owned something new before," she said softly. "Then this is a start," Colt replied. For the rest of the day, they worked side by side, Colt repairing a loose shutter, Taya washing the last of the town dust from the floorboards and laying the cabin to rights. By evening, the place looked cleaner, warmer, as though it belonged to both of them now. After supper, Colt sat by the fire with his coffee. Taya took the chair across from him, pulling her new coat around her shoulders even though the cabin was warm. "You aren't leaving this place after all," she said quietly. Colt looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "I thought about it. Thought about riding south and starting over somewhere else." He set the cup down, meeting her eyes. "But there's nowhere I'd rather be now." Taya's throat tightened. She crossed him, kneeling by the chair, so she could look up at him. "You could have let them take me that first day," she said. "You could have ridden away." "I tried that once before," Colt said, voice low. "Watched a man get strung up because I didn't speak soon enough. I don't run anymore." Her hand found his, resting over it on the arm of the chair. "Then I won't run either," she said. Colt stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He looked down at her for a long moment, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "Then stay," he said. "I will," she answered, and there was no hesitation. Their second kiss came easier than the first. No fear this time, no question of whether it was allowed. Colt's hand rested against her back, holding her steady, and she leaned into him, her breath warm against his face. When they drew apart, the firelight flickered over their faces, softening the lines of weariness that had marked them both. Colt touched her cheek briefly, then nodded toward the bedroll. "You don't need to sleep on the floor anymore," he said. Taya's lips parted slightly, but she didn't argue. She simply gathered her blanket and spread it on the bunk where Colt had slept alone for so long. That night, the fire burned low but steady. Colt lay on his side, arm draped over her waist, listening to the wind outside. Taya's breathing was slow and even, her face pressed against his chest. For the first time in years, Colt felt the weight he'd been carrying loosen enough to let him breathe fully. The cabin was no longer just a place to wait out the winter. It was a home, and the woman sleeping beside him was the reason he wanted to stay. When dawn came, Colt rose and stepped outside, looking over the quiet valley. There were no tracks in the fresh snow, no riders, no sound except the creak under its thin coat of ice. Taya joined him a moment later, her new coat wrapped around her shoulders. She stood close, her hand finding his without needing to look. "What now?" she asked. Colt looked out over the land, then at her. "Now we make this place ours," he said. Taya nodded, a small, certain smile touching her lips. For the first time in months, she felt not just safe, but rooted, like she belonged somewhere with someone who would not turn her away. Colt squeezed her hand once, then led her back inside. The day's work was waiting, and for the first time, both of them were ready to face it together.